Hey there, I'm going to do a overview of alcohol use in preparation for our event on Alcohol Awareness Month. Start by sharing my screen. Okay, hopefully you all can see my screen. So we're talking about the impact of alcohol use on personal health. So we'll start with a little bit of an overview. So alcohol, as I'm sure you already know, is an addictive substance. It's used widespread in the United States as a legal drug, as a recreational drug, and throughout the world. Social psychologists refer to alcohol as a social lubricant. So it's kind of a something that people use for a number of different reasons, including social reasons, as college students might do, especially during a time where they have some independence and some freedom for the first time after being away from their families, from their homes, or for being independent and adults for the first time in their lives. However, some people do not view alcohol as a drug. Some of the reasons why they see alcohol differently than we do other drugs is because alcohol is legal. It's what I said it earlier, it's a recreational drug, meaning it is a drug that is it's legal to use, but it doesn't serve any type of medical purpose. So other types of recreational drugs include tobacco and caffeine. Advertising and media promote drinking as normal. So we don't have ads that focus on things like cocaine or even marijuana, which is legal. Marijuana might also be seen as a recreational drug now. And tobacco companies cannot market their products the way that they once did, but alcohol advertising is still pervasive. There are large distributions and sales of alcohol, and this country and the world has a long history of alcohol use, but alcohol is indeed a drug. So a little bit of the history of alcohol use. So centuries ago in colonial times, Americans drank more alcohol than at any other time. There was not regulations about age or anything like that. So people drank different types of alcohol. During this time, alcohol was consumed due to sanitary and nutrition reasons. So sanitary because sanitation was lacking and well water was often contaminated with waste products such as animal waste. So alcohol was a preservative. And alcohol was also believed to be nutritious, as wine was often made with potatoes, carrots, lettuce, wheats, cranberries, squash, other types of vegetation. And so it was seen as doing something healthy. And consumption peaked in the 1700s to 1899, where a person named Benjamin Rush, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, he was the first one to identify alcoholism as a disease, and so noted some potential negative factors with alcohol for the first time. High alcohol consumption may have also contributed to an increase of suicide and other problems during the Civil War. Then we, with widespread use of alcohol and the understanding of the problematic nature of alcohol use, we saw the temperance movement. So this was a movement to reduce the consumption of alcohol, and even got us to the next slide, which is prohibiting the use of alcohol. So it initially started off as an educational campaign, and later got more strict, looking at the complete abstinence of alcohol use. And that got us to what is known as prohibition, which you may have heard about. So this was in the early 1900s. And the 18th Amendment was ratified and went into effect in 1920, and that prohibited the sale, transportation, and manufacturing of alcohol. Specifically, the Volstead Act defined any intoxicating substance as being illegal. And so there were impacts from prohibition, the economic impacts. Many thought that by reducing the prohibiting alcohol use would free up money that people would use on other things like household goods, clothing, entertainment costs. But they actually saw a decline, especially in entertainment venues. Restaurants saw losses because they saw a disruption in the sale of their of liquor sales, and so that reduced revenue. And this could not be taxed, so there was loss of revenue for the government. Also, realtors thought that rents would skyrocket as the saloons closed, which would improve neighborhoods. So there was the belief of all these impacts that would happen that didn't come into fruition. And so then there were some loopholes that we saw. The amendment, as you saw, I'll go back, it prohibited the sale, transportation, and manufacturing of alcohol, did not make it illegal to consume alcohol. So there, as you can imagine, there were always ways around this legislation. So we saw an increase in the number of pharmacists during this era because pharmacists were allowed to dispense alcohol for medical purposes. People started increasing their attendance at church because they could have access to wine. This led to an increase in self-professed Jewish religious figures who were able to dispense wine. And so also we saw an increase in the number that suffered from ailments that could be cured with alcohol. Other consequences, we saw crime increase, as you can imagine. So prohibition is believed to have contributed to a culture of lawlessness. It created this whole black market for beer and other alcoholic beverages. It was involved in corruption with government and police. And we saw an impact on crime, murder rates, and it created a condition for organized crime to thrive really well during this time. For example, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a result of a struggle between two rival gangs for control of the crime syndicate in Chicago. And these gangs were tied to the control of alcohol products and other things as well, but alcohol was a big component to their financial structure. And so this was one outcome that was noted. And so as we saw these negative impacts, then came the push to repeal prohibition, which was done so in the early 1930s. President Roosevelt signed the Cullen-Harrison Act that allowed the sale of beer. And then in 1933, we had a full ratification of the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition. So that's a little bit about the history. Let's talk about what alcohol is. So different types of alcohol, and I apologize, I might have some duplicate slides here. I was putting a few slide presentations together from my personal health class and my drugs and alcohol class. So I apologize if I come across a similar slide later. But different types of alcohol, but there is one type of alcohol that we use for drinking, that is ethyl alcohol, also known as ethanol. That is the intoxicating substance found in all alcoholic beverages. We are able to get ethyl alcohol from breaking down different products. I talked about potatoes and cranberries and squashes and other types of produce that over time they break down these structures in these foods, break down the sugars in them, and that's a process known as fermentation. To get to our liquors, there's a further process called distillation, where at high temperatures, you get a more pure form of alcohol, and that's when we get our liquors like vodka and whiskey. And we look at the alcoholic content of a product by measuring its proof. A proof is what's used to tell the percentage of alcohol, and it is simply the alcohol percentage times 2. So you can have a beverage that is theoretically pure alcohol would be 200 proof or 100% alcohol. So to get the percentage of alcohol, if you have the proof, you just cut it in half. So if something is 100 proof, that means it is 50% alcohol. Or to find out the proof, if you have the percentage, you double the percentage. So if something is 5% alcohol, then it is 10 proof. When we take in alcohol, it is absorbed in a few different places. About 20% is absorbed in the lining of the stomach. And the remaining 80% of absorption that occurs happens in the small intestine. And so what we absorb in the lining of our stomach is what we're going to feel the effects quickly from, but we are slowly absorbing the additional alcohol over time in our small intestine. But there are some factors that can change this proportion. So if the concentration of our drink and the drink type will have an impact on absorption. So higher concentration, we will have a higher percentage of absorption in our stomach. The amount consumed, if we are consuming just a little bit of alcohol, then we're going to have less that is absorbed in the lining of our stomach and more absorbed in our intestines. Same thing if we have food in our stomach, it's going to change that proportion. So less is absorbed in the stomach. Just how our metabolism functions will have an impact, and even our mood. And one other thing that's not on here is carbonation. So if we have a carbonated beverage, more of that absorption will occur in our stomach. Alcohol contains about 7 calories per gram. And so that is higher than we see with other types of foods that give us calories. And so one of the risks of prolonged alcohol use is weight gain, because it is has a pretty high potency of calories per gram. The breakdown of alcohol is fairly constant at about 0.5 ounces per hour. That's about the equivalent of about 1 drink. So if we're drinking 1 drink every hour, it's going to take our body about an hour to break down that alcohol and get it out of our body. If we're drinking more than at that rate, if we have 2 drinks in an hour, our body's not going to be able to break it down in that hour. And so the alcohol, unmetabolized alcohol, will circulate in our bloodstream until enough time has passed for our body to break it down. And this diagram is showing that what happens, how alcohol is consumed orally, breakdown in the stomach, through the walls of the stomach, and that gets into the bloodstream fairly quickly, then into the small intestines. And so either the stomach or the blood or the small intestines, alcohol gets into the bloodstream and carries it to all parts of the body, including our brain, our heart, and our liver. Our liver will help break down the alcohol over time. And so we call that breakdown oxidation. It will continue to oxidize the alcohol until it's all out of our system. And alcohol goes to the brain almost as soon as it is consumed. It continues to be circulated to the brain until it is fully oxidized. So alcohol is transformed in the liver into acetaldehyde. It leaves the body. This is some of that duplication I talked about, but this is basically saying that 1 drink per hour. And again, the small intestine is the primary site of absorption. And so what other factors can influence the effects of alcohol? In other words, if 2 people drink the same amount of alcoholic drinks, and one feels more drunk at the end of the night, what factors attribute to this? There can be a lot of different reasons that we can explore, but mood we talked about in the previous slide, body composition, whether somebody is born a male or female, because that might be an indicator of their body size, how much fat they have in their body, a person's tolerance. So a lot of different factors can affect how alcohol impacts a person. All right, that's duplication. So males and females absorb alcohol at different rates. So I mentioned this a second ago, women's bodies contain less water, which causes them to absorb alcohol more quickly. And men have more of enzyme known as alcohol dehydrogenase, which allows them to metabolize alcohol more quickly. Men have a lot more of this that is produced by their liver, so they break down alcohol more quickly than women. And the amount of alcohol in our bloodstream at a given time is known as our BAC, or our blood alcohol concentration. And we'll note this when we talk about drinking and driving and alcohol and car crashes. The legal limit for blood alcohol concentration in order to operate a motorized vehicle is 0.08 in all states. That has changed. We used to have only a few states that had it as low as 0.08, and other states all came on board. And so that is the BAC in all states now. And this can be measured in a few different ways, including a breathalyzer test, but the most accurate is going to be a blood test. I already mentioned this. And so this is just showing the psychological and physical effects of alcohol based on our blood alcohol concentration. If somebody's blood alcohol concentration is about 0.05 to 0.07, they may have some things that impair their driving or other activities, such as lowered alertness, impaired judgment, lowered inhibitions, and loss of small muscle control. But it's when we get to this 0.08 that we see impairments that definitely could have negative consequences for people, whether it's operating motor vehicles or just their own judgment that might put them at risk. So slowed reaction time, short-term memory loss, judgment impaired, inability to focus. And we start to get up, we see impaired consciousness, disorientation, loss of motor function, all the way up to when somebody might have something like alcohol poisoning, unconsciousness, coma, extremely slow heartbeat and respiration, unresponsiveness, and probable death. And so BAC, what I talked about before, is how a person feels, basically whether they feel drunk or tipsy or whatnot. But blood alcohol concentration also depends on factors. Weight and body fat, the water content in body tissues, the concentration of the beverage, alcohol concentration is higher in people with more body fat, and women generally have more body fat, and the alcohol dehydrogenase. So this was a repetition of what I talked about before. And this is the approximate BAC and the physiological and behavioral effects. So this might be something that's interesting for students to see and understand, is when they might get to that threshold where they are impaired, either slightly impaired or very impaired. And this is based on sex, body weight, and number of drinks consumed and period of time. So lots of different factors. But it might be interesting for somebody who is thinking about, how many drinks would be okay for me to have if I plan to go out and I need to drive home. If a woman is 140 pounds and she's going to be out for 3 hours, then she might be able to have 2 drinks and her BAC be in an okay range to drive. But this is just more of an indicator, and maybe to be on the safe side, she stays out for 5 hours and with only the 2 drinks, and that way there's a good chance that she's in this green area. So that's kind of how you can use a chart such as this. All right, let's take a look at use by college students, because that's what we're really concerned about. All types of problems we see with drinking in college students. So I already noted that alcohol exacerbates the risk for suicide, but also automobile crashes and falls. Many college students celebrate with alcohol, or they have practices or customs that involve alcohol use. The advertising the alcohol industry advertises specifically to college students. College students are targeted because they know that there is high use on college campuses, especially when we look at beer, because beer can be inexpensive. And so bars and alcohol companies will entice young people with drink specials that enable college students to consume large amounts of alcohol for a low price. We know that college students are vulnerable to peer influence. It doesn't just end at high school. And unfortunately, administrators often deny that a problem exists. We look at different ways that people use alcohol and can classify them in some cases. So there are what are known as social drinkers. Sometimes people say that this is low risk drinking, because people are typically just drinking in social situations. But I don't know. It also depends upon how much a person drinks. Maybe they're social drinkers and they feel compelled to drink more than they would otherwise because they're in social situations and they feel better. Remember that social lubricant, it makes socializing easier, or there is that peer pressure or just that culture of drinking. So it's not always, I know it says it here, but it's not always considered low risk. Problem drinkers, individuals who engage in risky alcohol consumptions. And this is really when we talk about people who might be dependent upon alcohol. Sometimes these individuals are able to modify their behavior when faced with negative consequence. They kind of have a learned behavioral tolerance. And then alcohol use disorder is when somebody is addicted. So they cannot control their drinking behaviors in spite of negative consequences. They are considered to be alcohol dependent or addicted, and they will experience withdrawal symptoms. This is looking at college students, and really what we get from this chart is there's not much difference between women and men in terms of alcohol use. Approximately 67% of college students report having consumed an alcoholic beverage in the past 30 days. A big issue that we see among college students is binge drinking. That's just basically, there's a definition there, but it's really just drinking with the intent of getting drunk. Students report that alcohol disrupts their sleep, decreases their alertness, and may affect academic performance. So just as we see with tobacco products, cost is a factor with use. So as cost increases, consumption decreases. We also see that where you live may play a role. So among young adults living in advantaged and more educated urban areas, alcohol consumption rates are greater. And then gender differences, more women seek treatment for alcohol and men have greater rates of alcohol use, although use by women has increased. Ethnicity may play a role. Whites typically begin drinking at an earlier age, but it does not mean that, so that just means that they might be drinking longer, but that doesn't mean that other racial ethnic groups don't have issues with drinking. In fact, there might be other issues that exacerbate drinking, and groups are targeted, definitely. In the LGBTQ persons, people who identify as LGBTQ, are targeted as well, because they tend to have higher rates of alcohol use. And I pulled this from another slide. I meant to change. I don't really like the term sexual minorities, but really we're talking about individuals who identify as LGBTQ as having higher rates. There have been increases for arrests on college campuses for alcohol and other drugs, especially when we think about parties and fraternities. There are questions sometimes about wet or dry campuses. In undergrad, I went to a school that was a dry campus, but it didn't really matter because as soon as you step across the street to the community around the campus, there were plenty of bars. And then for grad school, I was surprised that they even had they had a bar on campus, and I've since learned of other schools that have bars on campus and at sporting events that had alcohol. So debates on whether colleges should have policies regarding alcohol. So health effects. There are deaths every single year associated with alcohol use, and that can be related to accidents or crashes. I won't even call them accidents. If somebody is a victim who is not drinking, then it definitely is an accident, but we tend to call them car crashes rather than accidents because accidents means that it wasn't preventable. And if alcohol is involved, then it could have been prevented. But different cancers, other types of health issues that we'll talk about. So some negative impacts. Alcohol causes a severe dependence in some people. People who are dependent can have disruptions in their family lives, their social lives, professional lives. Consumption by college students causes approximately 2,000 deaths each year. And so this is showing the different body systems that are impacted by alcohol, both the short-term and the long-term effects. We see impacts on our brain, our senses, our digestive system, our urinary system, reproductive system, our bones. So we're going to take a look at some of these. So the brain is highly sensitive to alcohol, and large amounts of alcohol consumption can cause brain damage. and resulting in memory problems, disorientation, nerve damage, poor coordination. Our liver is a very important organ in our body. It helps us get rid of the bad stuff that our body doesn't need, or even good stuff, but stuff that our body doesn't need. And so over time, if we use too much alcohol, alcohol can cause damage to our liver, scarring and inflammation, which is a tough thing to do because the liver is a very hardy organ. It has the ability to regenerate, but if it is scarred and inflamed, it does not have that ability. Regenerate meaning it can create new tissue if it is damaged in any way. Well, not in any way, if it is damaged. And that's why you can do a live liver transplant, is that you can take somebody who is alive, take part of their liver, transplant it to another person who needs a liver, and the person who was donated the liver, their liver will regenerate back to the size that it was over time. But it can't do this if it is scarred and inflamed due to liver damage caused by something called cirrhosis, which is what can happen if somebody uses alcohol for a very long time. It can cause issues with our GI system. Regular consumption can cause inflammation of the esophagus, can lead to malnutrition, even lead to tooth decay and gum disease. Impacts on the cardiovascular system. So light to moderate alcohol use, you may have heard, can have some beneficial factors for our cardiovascular system. That's because certain types of alcohol, things that we find in components of alcohol, can increase HDLs, which is our high density lipoproteins, which is our good cholesterol. However, if you drink more than, if you drink too much alcohol, though, you are increasing your risk of all these other issues. And so it's not really a good excuse to start drinking alcohol. And there can be some negative impacts to our cardiovascular system, such as high blood pressure, arrhythmia, which is an irregular heartbeat, strokes. So not that all the other terrible news outweighs this good news. So alcohol and the immune system. So moderate alcohol use is associated with reduced inflammation and improved response to vaccination. However, that sounds like good news, but the jury's still out because there have been studies that showed contradictory results. So showed reduced immunity. So still some learning to do with the immune system. Cancer, the more alcohol a person consumes, the higher the risk is for lifetime cancer. And that's many different types of cancer, not just digestive system cancer. Breast cancer, colon cancer, esophagus, larynx. There's issues with alcohol and pregnancy, something called fecal alcohol syndrome. It's a general term describing various effects that may occur if a woman drinks moderate to heavy amounts of alcohol while pregnant. So it's advised that pregnant women should abstain from alcohol because we don't know. Maybe there is an amount that would not cause harm to a fetus, but we don't really know what that amount is. So probably best if women abstain. So other consequences. So drinking and driving. Surveys indicate that 23% of college students have driven after drinking, and that percentage is probably higher. People may not want to share about behavior that they might be ashamed about or embarrassed to admit. Alcohol impaired drivers are involved in about 1 in 3 crash deaths and nearly 10,000 deaths annually. the likelihood of a driver being involved in a fatal crash rises significantly with a BAC of 0.05 and even more rapidly after 0.08. And that is a chart showing the percentage of fatally injured drivers with BACs greater than 0.08 by driver age. And so we see up here, our young people are at the highest, 21 to 30 years old and 31 to 40 year olds. Alcohol-related societal costs are estimated to be over 220 billion. Alcohol is directly or indirectly responsible for over 25% of the nation's medical expenses, and underage drinking costs 62 billion annually. So underage drinking is the most widely used, alcohol is the most widely used drug among American youth. More than 4,300 deaths are attributed each year to underage drinking. And young people who drink alcohol combined with energy drinks experience more harm related to death. You might remember a few years ago, this is not legal anymore to produce, but like was Four Loko. It was alcohol, caffeinated alcoholic drink that was very popular with young people. And of course, alcoholism. So this is a type of problem drinking when somebody is dependent upon alcohol. We now call it alcohol use disorder. If somebody who has alcohol use disorder wants to stop drinking, that is a great thing, but it is oftentimes best to do under supervision of a facility, because the withdrawal can be very difficult. So withdrawal are symptoms that a person has when they're as their body gets used to not having a particular type of drug. And so when somebody is truly addicted to something, they will have withdrawal from it, including alcohol. Because of the severe nature of withdrawal for alcohol, somebody who is alcohol dependent should be under the medical care of a treatment facility because of something called delirium tremens. And that is something that some people experience when they withdraw from alcohol, and it can be fatal for some people. This is just showing the stages of withdrawal and some of the symptoms that a person might have, including anxiety, insomnia, high blood pressure, hallucinations, even seizures. We have here signs of both problem drinking and signs of alcoholism. So signs of problem drinking include things like the need to feel comfortable, the need to use alcohol to feel comfortable in social situations, to feel happy, to have a good time, or to escape, which is something that you can imagine some college students use because they find themselves in these situations. And signs of alcoholism, an inability to control drinking after the first drink, obsessing about alcohol. So thinking about when a person doesn't have alcohol, thinking about it, like, you know, if the person's at work, like, oh, I can't wait until it's 5 o'clock and I get home and I can have a drink, or even maybe before they get home. Setting limits on drinking, but not being able to adhere to them, blacking out, not being able to remember what happened. So those are signs of alcoholism. Some factors that increase the risk of alcohol use disorder. Genetics may play a role. Psychosocial factors, having a mood or an anxiety disorder, depression. And alcohol is a depressant. I didn't mention that before, even though it might seem like people might be more outgoing and social when they have alcohol. Those are the initial effects. Those are short term. Alcohol slows down our body system, our breathing, our digestion, our heart rate. Other things that increase the risk of alcohol use disorder, culture. And that can be our given culture, our subculture, our neighborhood, our family system, being a college student. Those are all different types of culture that might impact the amount that we drink in the context in which we drink. And then alcohol and society. Alcohol has a devastating effect on our society. We've talked about car crashes and other accidents. I've mentioned the connection between alcohol use and suicide, violence in family, and the impact of alcoholism on children. Lots of different ways that that might manifest itself. And so children of parents with alcohol use disorder, they are more likely than others to suffer from depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, substance abuse, and interpersonal difficulties. And so children, may not realize it when they are children, but as they get older, they should realize that growing up in a household where a parent or both parents were using alcohol, or other adults in the family had alcohol use disorder, does not represent normalcy. I don't want to say that they're not a normal family, but that the way that they may have been treated because of the alcohol use or the dependency is not normal. And they are not responsible for the behaviors of their parents. And they can find the skills to form healthy relationships if they were not able to. I don't want to assume that somebody who, children who grew up in households with a problem drinker means that they did not form healthy relationships. But if they didn't, that is a skill that they can acquire. So that is all for this overview of alcohol. I know it was a lot. I know it was quick, but should give you some groundwork to be able to think about the use of alcohol among college students and get you ready for our event. All right, I will end this now. All right, and please reach out to me if you have any questions or you need follow-up on anything. Thanks.